I got home earlier than usual that evening, stepping into air so thick with humidity it clung to my skin like an unwelcome second layer. The weather practically screamed that a storm was brewing, but what truly unsettled me was the eerie stillness inside the house. Normally, I'd hear Bonnie bustling around downstairs, her footsteps, the faint hum of the TV, or the occasional clatter of dishes. This time, though, it was unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. After a draining day packed with endless meetings, looming deadlines, and more tasks than I could count. My only goal was to step inside, grab a cold beer, and collapse on the couch for just a sliver of peace. Of course, that peace would probably be short-lived once Bonnie started up with her usual monologue about her day, never missing an opportunity to unload every minor inconvenience she'd faced. But even that would have been better than this silence, which felt unnatural, almost oppressive. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. Something was off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. The house felt different, as though the very air had grown denser, suffocating in a way that made my skin crawl. I lingered in the entryway, taking in the absence of all the usual sounds. No chatter from the TV, no clinking dishes in the sink, and, most unsettling of all, no sound of Bonnie coming to greet me with her usual litany of complaints or requests. Unable to shake the feeling, I started climbing the stairs, even though I didn't really know why. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was more like a nagging instinct, something primal, gnawing at the edges of my mind and urging me forward. The closer I got to the top, the heavier the air seemed, like I was walking into something I couldn't yet see but already dreaded. My steps slowed, and I found myself moving carefully, almost unconsciously trying not to make a sound. And that's when I heard it, a low, muffled groan. It was faint, but unmistakable, the kind of sound that stops you dead in your tracks. My brain scrambled to find a rational explanation, clinging to the hope that what I was imagining couldn't possibly be real. But deep down, something inside me already knew. My stomach twisted, my pulse thundered in my ears, and for a moment, I stood frozen on the landing, caught between denial and a tidal wave of rage. Then it came again, louder this time, and with it the sound of movement. The noise was coming from our bedroom. My bedroom. The realization hit me like a slap, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me down the hallway. The soft carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I neared the door, which was left slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the mirror inside. And there they were, reflected in the glass, tangled together on the bed Bonnie and I had shared for years. She was underneath him, her flushed face twisted with a kind of passion I hadn't seen in her in years. Not for me, anyway. She didn't even notice me standing there. And him, it was Clark, my best friend, the man I'd trusted like a brother. He was hunched over her, pressing into her with an intensity that made me sick to my stomach. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, sharp and visceral. My chest tightened as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. My thoughts raced, but none of them stuck. All I could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer weight of what I was witnessing. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to process what was right in front of me. But there it was. My wife, my best friend, together, and me, stuck in that doorway, unable to look away like that. Instead, I stepped back slowly, retreating down the stairs as quietly as I'd climbed them. Each step felt heavier than the last, my mind spinning with rage, heartbreak, and something colder, sharper, calculation. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. Not yet. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed time to plan. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused for a moment, exhaling shakily as I forced myself to stay composed. Then, I slipped out the front door, careful not to make a sound. Night had fallen, and the rain was starting to come down in soft, steady drops, but I barely noticed. My mind was elsewhere, drowning in a storm of its own. I stumbled toward my car, my breaths coming fast and shallow, each one laced with fury. Once inside, I gripped the steering wheel so hard it felt like it might snap beneath my hands. The image of them together burned in my mind, vivid and unrelenting. Bonnie's face, twisted with pleasure, haunted me. Clark's body, entwined with hers like he had any right to be there, turned my stomach. The betrayal didn't just hurt. It annihilated every bit of trust I'd ever had in either of them. What was left wasn't love or sadness. It was a void, a deep, hollow emptiness. But even as my anger threatened to consume me, I knew better than to act on impulse. That would be too easy, too predictable. Let them believe they'd gotten away with it. Let Bonnie go on pretending to be the devoted wife, cooking me meals, kissing me goodnight, all the while sneaking off to meet Clark. Let Clark keep playing the loyal friend, acting as though nothing had changed. They thought they were clever, hiding their affair from me. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't just going to catch them, I was going to dismantle their lives piece by piece. And the beauty of it? They wouldn't see it coming. By the time they realized what I'd done, it would already be too late. Clark, in particular, was going to learn just how personal this was. He loved his wife, Daisy, in the most superficial way possible, like a trophy to show off. He paraded their perfect little family around, the polished house, the kids, the idyllic suburban life. If he wanted to destroy my family, it was only fair I return the favor. But I wouldn't just take Daisy away from him. I'd make her mine. Not in the careless, sordid way Clark had taken Bonnie, but slowly, deliberately. This wasn't about lust. It was about control, about revenge. I started the car, the engine roaring to life as the rain intensified, the steady rhythm of the drops masking the storm churning inside me. My grip on the wheel loosened as a cold smile crept across my face. This wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of their downfall, and I intended to savor every moment of it. I drove aimlessly through the rain-slicked streets that night, the windshield wipers ticking rhythmically as my thoughts crystallized. My anger had shifted from something raw and unrefined to something colder, sharper, a weapon I intended to wield with precision. The shock of seeing Bonnie and Clark together was already fading, replaced by a steely resolve. True revenge wasn't rushed. It wasn't a hasty act born of blind fury. No, to truly make them suffer, I'd need patience. I would destroy them so thoroughly that by the time they realized what was happening, they'd be standing in the rubble of their own lives. And Clark would be my first target. That smug bastard had always carried himself like he was untouchable, like he could take anything that wasn't his and face no consequences. He thought I was a pushover, an easy mark. What he didn't know was how well I understood him, his life, his weaknesses, and most importantly, Daisy. She was the key to it all. Clark had spent years building the image of a perfect life. His house, his wife, his kids, the white picket fence. He couldn't resist showing it all off, boasting about how great everything was. It was a facade, and I was going to rip it apart, starting with Daisy. I didn't just want to hurt Clark. I wanted to destroy the very foundation of his existence, the life he valued so much. And I was going to enjoy every second of it, that I knew the only way to truly devastate Clark was to strike at what mattered to him most. Daisy. But this wasn't going to be some shallow, meaningless affair where I'd seduce her, claim victory, and brag about it later. That wasn't enough. No, I wanted to go deeper, to inflict the kind of pain that lingered. I didn't just want to sleep with Daisy. I wanted to take her from him in a way that would cut him to the core. I needed her to fall for me, genuinely, irrevocably, to make her question everything she thought she knew about Clark, to make her doubt him, mistrust him, and ultimately turn away from him. In the end, I didn't want her to choose me because of lust or some fleeting passion. I wanted her choice to come from a place of real affection, of trust, of belief that I was the better man. And when that moment came, when I had her heart completely in my grasp, I would make sure Clark saw every second of it. I wanted him to watch as his perfect world crumbled to dust right before his eyes. What made this plan so perfect, so intoxicating, was how easily I could execute it. I knew Daisy better than Clark ever had. Her insecurities, her fears, her quiet longings. I'd seen them all over the years. She wasn't like Bonnie, loud and self-absorbed, always hungry for attention. Daisy was different. Quieter, more introspective, with a delicate side that Clark never truly appreciated. To him, she was just another shiny object, something to flaunt at parties or family gatherings, another reason to puff out his chest and boast. but I had noticed the cracks long before this moment. I'd seen the vulnerability she tried to hide, the subtle sadness behind her polite smiles. Now I was ready to exploit every inch of it. As I glanced down at my phone that evening, I considered whether tonight should be the night I made my first move. A simple text, a casual check-in, would be enough to start setting the pieces in motion. But I stopped myself. Patience was crucial. If I moved too quickly, the plan could unravel. No, I had to lay the foundation carefully, brick by brick, ensuring every step was calculated and deliberate. Instead, I drove home, slipping seamlessly back into my role as the clueless, unsuspecting husband. The beauty of my position was how little Bonnie knew. She had no idea I was onto her. That ignorance was my greatest advantage. It gave me the upper hand, the freedom to move unseen while she continued her charade. When I walked into the house, I could hear her upstairs, humming softly, probably getting ready for bed, entirely unaware that her betrayal had turned our home into a battleground. Every note of that hum grated on me, echoing her disloyalty in a way that made my skin crawl. Still, I kept my expression neutral as I moved through the kitchen, pulling open the fridge like it was just another night. She appeared at the top of the stairs a few moments later, wearing one of my old, worn-out t-shirts, the same kind she'd once loved to sleep in. It used to make me smile, the way she'd curl up in it like it was the most comfortable thing in the world. Now, it felt like mockery, a cruel reminder of the love she'd so casually discarded. "You're home late," she said, her tone light and conversational as she filled a glass of water. The audacity was breathtaking. She spoke like nothing had happened, like she hadn't been upstairs earlier, tangled up with Clark in our bed. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice steady and flat. "Got caught up at work." The words came easily, a lie slipping from my mouth as naturally as if it were the truth. She crossed the room and kissed my cheek, a quick, casual gesture that made my skin crawl. "I missed you today," she said with a smile that would have seemed sweet if I didn't know what it hid. I gave her a thin, cold smile in return, my mask firmly in place. "I missed you too." The lie came effortlessly now, like second nature. She had no idea those words carried a double meaning. I missed the version of her I thought I knew, the one who hadn't betrayed me. As she turned and headed back upstairs, humming again, I watched her go. How long did she think she could keep this up? How long would she pretend, assuming I was none the wiser? I wasn't ready to confront her yet. That moment would come in time once my plan was fully set in motion. For now, she and Clark likely thought they were safe, that they could continue their little affair in the shadows without consequence. What they didn't realize was that the ground beneath them had already started to shift. The sheer audacity of her casual demeanor was almost impressive. "Yeah?" I replied, my tone measured and calm, refusing to betray even a flicker of the storm inside me. "Got caught up at work." Bonnie stepped closer and kissed my cheek, as if everything between us was perfectly normal. "I missed you today," she said, her voice sweet, almost saccharine. I forced a tight, practiced smile, a mask I'd perfected. "I missed you too," I lied effortlessly, the words slipping from my mouth like second nature. I didn't miss her. Not this version of her. Not the woman who could betray me so completely and act as though nothing had happened. As she turned and walked back upstairs, humming that same infuriating tune, I watched her go, my gaze cold and calculating. How long did she think she could keep up this charade? How long did she believe I'd stay oblivious? But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until my plan was firmly in place. Timing was everything, and I was determined to let her dig her own grave a little deeper before I struck. She and Clark probably thought they were clever, that their secret was safe, that they could keep their affair hidden and carry on without a hitch. Little did they know, the foundation of their deceit was already crumbling beneath them. The very next day, I began executing my plan. I reached out to Daisy under the guise of a friendly check-in, something harmless and unremarkable. We'd known each other for years. It wasn't unusual for me to send her a quick message. No one would think twice about it. I asked her how she was doing, how life was treating her, and casually suggested meeting for coffee. To my mild surprise, she replied almost instantly. Her eagerness was telling. Perhaps she was desperate for a distraction. Some reprieve from the hollow shell of a marriage Clark had left her with. I didn't mind. Her willingness worked perfectly in my favor. A few days later, we arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in town. It was a small, inconspicuous place, the kind where patrons mind their own business and rarely spare a glance at anyone else. It wasn't unusual for Daisy and me to meet up occasionally. After all, Clark and I were close, and our families had spent plenty of time together over the years. But this time was different. This wasn't just a friendly catch-up. This was part of a carefully constructed plan. When I arrived, I spotted her almost immediately. She was seated near the back, away from the bustling entrance, her posture slightly slouched, her expression weary. Even before she spoke, it was clear the weight of the world was pressing down on her. She managed a small smile when our eyes met, but it didn't quite reach the sadness lingering in her gaze. "Thanks for meeting me," I said warmly as I approached, my tone light and casual, like nothing was out of the ordinary. "It's been a while." "Yeah," she replied softly, her voice carrying a hint of exhaustion. "Things have been busy." I didn't press her. I didn't need to. The cracks in her demeanor were already there, visible and widening. This was what I'd counted on, her vulnerability, her loneliness. And now I was ready to exploit it, that I knew exactly what she was hinting at. Clark, the so-called picture-perfect husband, was anything but. As she spoke, I guided the conversation gently, asking about the kids, her art studio, and anything else that would keep her talking. All the while, I studied her closely, analyzing every shift in her tone, every fleeting expression of doubt or sadness that crossed her face. I was looking for cracks, and they were there, deeper than I'd even hoped. It didn't take long for the conversation to shift into more personal territory. That's when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. "I've been struggling with everything," she finally confessed, her voice low and uncertain as her eyes dropped to the table. "It feels like Clark and I are drifting apart, like we're not connecting anymore." I leaned forward just slightly, my tone soft, supportive, and tinged with genuine-sounding concern. "I'm really sorry to hear that, Daisy. You don't deserve to feel like this. You deserve so much more." Her eyes lifted to meet mine, searching for something, reassurance, validation, maybe even hope. Whatever it was, I gave it to her without hesitation. "You've always been such a good friend," she said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and vulnerability. "I don't know what I'd do without people like you." I smiled warmly at her, but the gesture was purely calculated. "You're not alone, Daisy. I'm here anytime you need someone to talk to. You can always count on me." She returned the smile, but hers was different, sad, wistful. The kind of smile that belonged to someone beginning to realize that their carefully constructed life wasn't as perfect as they'd once believed. And that was exactly what I needed her to feel. Doubt, uncertainty. I wanted to plant a seed of unease in her heart, one that would take root and grow until it consumed everything she thought she knew about her marriage. As I walked out of the cafe and into the soft drizzle of rain, a surge of triumph coursed through me. Everything was unfolding exactly as I'd planned, one carefully calculated step at a time. Clark had no idea the same woman he'd betrayed me with was about to become the one who dismantled his world. He wouldn't even see it coming. I reached my car, the rain tapping gently against the roof, a perfect backdrop for the storm I was carefully orchestrating. This was only the beginning. The day after meeting Daisy, I felt an electrifying rush simmering just beneath the calm, collected exterior I wore for the world. The slow burn of my revenge had started, and it was intoxicating. There was no stopping it now. Clark remained blissfully ignorant, unaware of the noose tightening around him, while Daisy was already starting to see me in a new light, something more than just her husband's friend. It was subtle, just as I intended. Daisy needed to trust me, to believe I understood her in ways Clark never could. That trust was the foundation I would build upon, brick by deliberate brick, until she looked at me not as a friend but as a savior, as someone who truly saw her. And when that day came, It would destroy Clark completely. Meanwhile, Bonnie carried on as if nothing had changed, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. She kept up her routine of sending me mind-numbing texts about grocery lists, weekend plans, and other trivialities, acting like everything between us was perfectly fine. She had no idea that I could see right through her carefully constructed facade. In her mind, I was still clueless, oblivious to the twisted little game she and Clark had been playing. But soon enough, she'd realize just how wrong she'd been. It was a Thursday evening, about a week after my coffee with Daisy, when I decided it was time to escalate my plan. I knew Clark would be stuck at work late, wrapped up in some big project he'd been rambling about. That project was his perfect alibi, his usual cover for sneaking around. But tonight I wasn't concerned with Bonnie. Tonight my focus was entirely on Daisy. I drove to their house with my excuse carefully prepared. I'd show up unannounced, playing the role of the caring, concerned friend. Daisy had opened up to me during our last conversation, confiding her feelings of neglect and isolation. I knew she'd appreciate the gesture, or at least she'd welcome the distraction. As I pulled up to their two-story house, the rain began to fall harder, casting a soft haze over the quiet neighborhood. Their home looked cozy and inviting, the warm glow of the lights spilling onto the rain-slicked pavement. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of the TV casting flickering light in their living room. Painted a picture of comfort and normalcy, but I knew better. This wasn't going to be difficult. Not at all. I knocked on the door, making sure my demeanor was calm and casual, as though this was nothing more than a friendly visit. A moment later, the door opened, and there was Daisy, her expression shifting quickly from surprise to warmth. "Oh, hey," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I didn't expect to see you." Her tone was genuine, her surprise evident. I gave her a relaxed smile, brushing a bit of rain from my jacket as I stepped inside. "Yeah, I thought I'd drop by. Just happened to be in the neighborhood," I said smoothly, lying without hesitation. I hadn't been anywhere near their neighborhood, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Instead, she looked pleased, even happy to see me. "Clark isn't home," she said, a faint note of apology in her voice. "I know," I replied effortlessly, my voice calm and assured. "I'm here for you." The words landed like a pebble breaking the surface of a still pond. I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a momentary hesitation. But then she smiled, a soft, almost shy smile, and stepped back to lead me into the living room. "Can I get you something to drink?" she offered, her tone polite but tinged with nervous energy. "Wine would be great," I said, settling comfortably into the couch. As she disappeared into the kitchen, I could hear the clink of glasses, the faint hum of the refrigerator door opening and closing. I let my eyes wander around the room, taking in the carefully curated decor, the family photos on the walls, the warmth of the space. It was a perfect setting, a picture-perfect home, but underneath it all, there were cracks. Cracks I intended to widen until the whole thing collapsed. When Daisy returned, holding 2 glasses of wine, she handed me one and settled into the chair across from me. I thanked her, raising my glass slightly, offering her a reassuring smile. She was nervous, I could tell, but that was fine. Nervous was good. Nervous meant she was starting to feel the pull, starting to see me not just as Clark's friend, but as someone who genuinely cared about her in a way Clark never had. And that was exactly what I needed. When she came back, she handed me a glass of red wine and settled on the couch beside me, closer than usual. Her presence felt tentative, almost hesitant, but I could sense she wanted to be near me. I turned to her, keeping my voice soft and warm, radiating the perfect blend of concern and attentiveness. "How are you holding up?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, as if her answer truly mattered to me. Daisy sighed deeply, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass as she stared into the dark liquid. "It's been tough," she admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Clark's been so distant lately. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like he just doesn't care anymore." I nodded sympathetically, my expression carefully measured. "You're not wrong to feel that way," I said, my tone steady and supportive. "You know how Clark is. He's never been good at appreciating what he has. Her gaze lifted to meet mine. Her eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and longing. "You've always been so good to us," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without friends like you." I let her words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Then, slowly and deliberately, I reached over and placed my hand gently on her knee. The gesture was intimate but restrained, just enough to send a message without crossing a boundary. "You deserve more than this, Daisy," I murmured, my voice low and sincere. "You deserve someone who sees your worth, someone who truly values you." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she didn't pull away. She just sat there. Her wide eyes locked on mine as the uncertainty in her expression began to shift into something deeper. The tension between us was palpable, the space between us shrinking with every second. The air felt thick, charged with something undeniable. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she lowered her gaze to where my hand rested on her knee. "I do," I replied, leaning in just enough to make my intentions clear without stepping over the line. My tone was calm, coaxing, every word carefully chosen. "You deserve better than what Clark gives you. I think you know that deep down." She looked down, her inner turmoil written plainly across her face. I could see her warring with herself, torn between the loyalty she still felt toward Clark and the yearning for something more, something he'd failed to provide. "I shouldn't," she began, her voice shaky, her fingers tightening around her glass. I interrupted her gently, keeping my tone soft and understanding. "I'm not asking for anything, Daisy. I'm just being honest with you." My words carried no demands, only reassurance, an open door she could walk through if she chose. She hesitated, her breathing shallow, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to respond but couldn't quite find the words. For a brief moment, I thought she might pull away. But then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned in closer. Her lips parted, her eyelids fluttering shut, and I knew she was ready for the kiss. It would have been so easy to close the gap, to press my lips to hers and take the final step. But not yet. This wasn't about rushing. This was about control, about making her want it, about letting her feel the ache of unfulfilled desire. So, instead, I leaned back slightly, creating a deliberate distance between us. The confusion in her eyes was immediate, her expression faltering as the moment shattered. "I should get going," I said casually, my tone light, as though nothing significant had just passed between us. But I let a trace of tension linger in my voice, a thread of something unfinished to keep her guessing. Daisy blinked rapidly, as if breaking out of a trance. "Yeah, maybe that's a good idea," she murmured, her voice faint, almost uncertain. I stood slowly, placing my glass down on the coffee table with deliberate precision. "We'll talk soon," I said, offering her a subtle, knowing smile. It was a smile that carried secrets, promises left unspoken. "And remember, I'm here for you." As I stepped out into the rain, I could feel her gaze following me, lingering on my back. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I'd left her with enough to think about, enough to wonder what might have happened, what could still happen. This was the game I was playing, and I was winning. The weight of our conversation lingered between us, thick and undeniable, even after I'd left her house. Daisy was standing on a precipice, torn between the loyalty she felt bound to and the temptation she couldn't ignore. All she needed now was the smallest push, and I'd be there to catch her when she fell. By the time I reached my car, the rain had eased, leaving the world quiet and damp. I paused briefly, inhaling the cool, rain-soaked air, savoring the sense of control coursing through me. The first phase of my plan had gone off without a hitch. Clark had taken everything from me, my wife, my life. But what he didn't realize was that I was carefully orchestrating the exact same fate for him. Only this time I'd be patient, precise. When I was done, Clark wouldn't just lose Daisy. He'd lose everything. For now I was content to wait, to let the tension grow, to let betrayal fester and build until the perfect moment to let it all implode. The next few days passed in a strange, uneasy calm, a fragile silence that had become my new normal. Bonnie carried on as if nothing had changed, sending me saccharine texts, pretending to be the loving, devoted wife. All the while, she was sneaking off to meet Clark, deluded into thinking their affair was invisible to me. They were getting careless, sloppy, overconfident in their belief that I was oblivious. Watching her go through her days, smiling like she had the world in her hands, was almost comical. She didn't see the cracks beneath her feet, the ones I'd carefully started widening. Soon, the illusion she called her perfect life would shatter. But not yet. For now, I kept my mask firmly in place, playing the role of the clueless husband. In fact, I turned up the charm, complimenting her, planning spontaneous dates, and showering her with attention. If she noticed the change in my behavior, she didn't let on. Maybe she was too preoccupied with her lies to see the truth. Or maybe she was too naive to question the game I was playing. Either way, it was working. She thought she was in control. But really, I was keeping her just disoriented enough not to notice what was happening right under her nose. While Bonnie played her part, Daisy became my real focus. After that night in her living room, I had seen the shift in her. She started reaching out more frequently, sending me messages and confiding in me about her frustrations. At first, it was subtle, venting about minor annoyances with Clark, her general sense of loneliness. But each time, I gently guided her further, pulling her closer to me and further from Clark. Slowly, I deepened the divide between them, all without him even noticing. By the end of the week, I knew it was time to escalate. I'd been patient, careful not to move too fast, but the timing was perfect now. Clark had mentioned in passing that he'd be away for a work conference. The irony of him bragging about it, oblivious to the opportunity his absence created, wasn't lost on me. On Friday evening, as the house grew quiet, I sent Daisy a simple message. Nothing too direct, just enough to set the stage. "How are you holding up? Could you use some company?" Her reply came almost immediately. A brief pause before her message lit up my phone. She was home alone and, judging by her quick response, in desperate need of a distraction. I didn't hesitate. The drive to her house was swift, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as my pulse quickened. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the pale glow of streetlights. The air smelled fresh and damp, mingling with something heavier, anticipation. Tonight I'd push things forward. When I arrived, Daisy greeted me at the door with a tired smile. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the week had finally caught up with her. "Thanks for coming," she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. "It's been such a long week." I didn't need to ask what she meant. The weariness in her eyes, the way she carried herself. It was all there. Clark's indifference had worn her down, and she looked like someone who had been holding everything together for far too long. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. "I'm always here for you," I replied, my tone warm and familiar, the words slipping out with ease. I offered her a reassuring smile, one I'd perfected for moments like this. She led me into the living room, where the dim, soft lighting created a tranquil, almost intimate atmosphere. As we sat down, she poured 2 glasses of wine. The gesture seemed innocent, but in the stillness of the room, it carried a quiet intensity. I positioned myself close enough for her to feel my presence, but not close enough to make her uncomfortable. Not yet. At first, the conversation stayed on safe, predictable topics: work, the kids, the day-to-day details that filled her life. But as the wine began to flow and the evening stretched on, the conversation shifted. I could feel the walls she'd built around herself start to crumble. Her resolve weakened, and the cracks I'd been waiting for grew larger. "It's just," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending." She paused, staring down into her glass. "Clark is never here, and when he is, it's like he's a stranger. I feel like I'm losing him." Her voice faltered, thick with emotion. "Or maybe I already have." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with despair and longing. This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the perfect moment to slip inside and make my presence undeniable. I reached out slowly, deliberately, and placed my hand gently over hers. My touch was soft but deliberate, carrying just enough weight to let her know I wasn't simply offering comfort. "You haven't lost him, Daisy?" I said quietly, my voice steady and calm. "But maybe it's time to let go of something that isn't working anymore. You deserve more than this. You deserve more than feeling invisible in your own marriage." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and uncertain, searching mine as if trying to find the answers she couldn't articulate. For a moment, she didn't speak, her breath caught in her throat. Then, with a trembling voice, she admitted, "I don't know what to do. I've tried so hard to make it work, but I just feel so alone." "You're not alone," I said firmly, my tone low and reassuring. "I'm here." Her hand didn't pull away from mine. Instead, she sat there, staring at me as if weighing her next move, the space between us thick with unspoken possibilities. "I've always been here," I said softly, my words hanging in the charged air between us. Without responding, Daisy leaned in. Her lips brushed against mine, hesitant, testing the waters, as though she wasn't entirely sure of her own actions. I kissed her back, matching her energy, letting the moment linger just long enough before I pulled away. My breath remained steady, calm, as though this was exactly how it was always meant to happen. Her eyes widened, and she recoiled slightly, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. "I shouldn't have done that," she stammered, her voice thick with regret. "I'm so sorry." I shook my head gently, keeping my tone soothing. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." Her eyes darted to mine, confusion and guilt flickering in their depths. "But what about Clark?" she asked, her voice shaky, filled with doubt and uncertainty. "Clark isn't here," I said simply, my voice quiet yet firm. "And if he were, would you even feel this right now?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. She knew she had crossed a line, but beneath her guilt, I could see something else, relief. She didn't truly regret the kiss. Not entirely. Deep down, she was grappling with the weight of finally feeling something again. Something real. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. "I feel so lost." I reached for her hand, taking it in mine and giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're not lost, Daisy," I said, my voice steady, reassuring. "You're finally starting to see things clearly. The truth is right in front of you. All you have to do is reach for it." The room fell into a heavy silence, thick with unspoken truths and choices waiting to be made. Daisy sat frozen at the crossroads of the life she'd always known and the chance for something different, something new. And I was right there, ready to help her take the next step. This time, when she leaned in, there was no hesitation. Her kiss was desperate, hungry, as though she had been holding herself back for far too long. I responded in kind, my arms wrapping around her, pulling her closer. I felt her warmth, her vulnerability, the weight of the choices we were both making. For that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Clark, not Bonnie. It was just us, two people drawn together by something undeniable. When Daisy finally pulled away, her breath came quickly, her eyes conflicted yet longing. "I don't know if we should," she started, her voice faltering as uncertainty crept back in. I stopped her mid-sentence with another kiss, silencing her doubts. I didn't want her to overthink. Not now. Not when we were standing at the edge of something transformative, something inevitable. Slowly, purposefully, I let my touch reassure her, my movements deliberate and careful. "We're already here, Daisy," I murmured softly. The hesitation in her eyes flickered, then disappeared, as she leaned into me again. This time, her kiss was deeper, more certain. I felt the barriers she'd clung to for so long finally crumble, leaving nothing but raw vulnerability in their place. She let herself go, completely immersed in the moment, and I guided her, moving with her in perfect rhythm. There was no rush. We both knew where this was heading. My lips brushed the curve of her neck, and she pressed closer to me, her breath hitching, the tension between us thick and electric. My hand found its way under her shirt, tracing the soft line of her back, eliciting a quiet sigh that sent a surge of satisfaction through me. Step by step, we made our way to the bedroom, the charged silence between us snapping like a taut wire. What followed wasn't rushed or careless. It was deliberate, a culmination of everything that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. When we reached the bed, any lingering doubts or guilt melted away, swept aside by the gravity of what we both knew was inevitable. The hours that followed were a blur of stolen touches and whispered words, moments that felt both familiar and forbidden. We explored each other slowly, savoring every brush of skin, every gentle caress. There was no need for urgency. This was about more than just the physical. It was about rediscovering what had been lost, about filling the voids left behind by neglect and indifference. As the night deepened, restraint gave way to something far more powerful. We let go entirely, leaving nothing unsaid, no inch of space between us untouched. When it was over, we lay together in the stillness, the room shrouded in darkness, broken only by the faint sound of our breathing as it gradually steadied. Daisy rested her head against my chest, her fingers tracing slow, aimless patterns along my arm. "I never thought I'd do something like this," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion, but also something else, relief. I didn't answer. Words weren't necessary. Instead, I wrapped my arm around her, my fingers tangling gently in her hair as I stared up at the ceiling. I could feel the shift in her, the way she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. And with that came my own sense of satisfaction. Daisy, so lost and neglected in her marriage, was here now, with me. As she drifted into sleep, I stayed awake, my mind churning. This wasn't just about the physical connection we just shared. That was inevitable, something that had been building for weeks. No, this was about so much more. This was about power, about control. It was about turning the tables on Clark in a way he could never have anticipated. And what made it all the sweeter was that Daisy had no idea she was a part of something far larger than herself. To her, this was a fleeting reprieve from loneliness, a desperate moment of connection. To me, it was part of a meticulously planned game. In the weeks that followed, things began to shift, and not for the better. The lightness of stolen moments gave way to something darker, heavier. Choices had been made, lines had been crossed, and the consequences were already starting to ripple outward. Daisy, Clark, Bonnie, they were all pieces on the board, and I was the one moving them. This was only the beginning. I kept the momentum steady, carefully pulling the strings of my plan. Bonnie and Clark were pawns now, their affair a weak and predictable move I used to my advantage. Meanwhile, Daisy was mine, completely drawn into my world. Every text, every touch, every shared glance brought her closer, deepening her bond with me. She trusted me completely, and I used that trust to keep her tethered. 3 weeks later, we found ourselves at another dinner party. A small, casual gathering, the kind of event that might once have felt routine. But nothing was routine anymore, not after what had happened between us. Clark and Bonnie were there, playing their roles as the perfect spouses, laughing with our friends, pretending their affair was a secret. It was pathetic, really, watching them act as though no one could see through their lies. But tonight wasn't about them. Tonight was about Daisy. As the evening buzzed around us, I stayed close to her, careful not to draw attention to the unspoken connection between us. Every move, every interaction was calculated, ensuring no one would suspect. But I could sense something was off. Daisy seemed quieter than usual, her smiles forced, her glances in my direction more frequent and urgent. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She pulled me aside, her hand brushing mine as she whispered, "Can we talk?" Her voice trembled, and her eyes were wide, filled with something I couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or something even deeper. I followed her into the kitchen, the door clicking shut behind us, muffling the sound of laughter and conversation from the party. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the air heavy with tension. She turned to face me, her hands trembling as she nervously twisted the hem of her sleeve. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice low and even. There was a palpable edge to her demeanor that sent my mind racing. Something was wrong, something big. She took a shaky breath, her lips quivering as she struggled to form the words. I don't know how to say this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just say it, I urged, stepping closer. My heart was pounding now, my mind churning through possibilities. Her anxiety was almost suffocating, her chest rising and falling quickly as she tried to speak. Finally, the words came out, soft but devastating. I'm pregnant. The sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap, loud and deafening in its silence. I stood frozen, the weight of what she'd said hitting me like a physical blow. Pregnant. The word echoed in my head as I tried to process it. Are you sure? I asked, my voice unsteady, scanning her face for any sign that this might not be real. She nodded, biting her lower lip as her eyes filled with tears. I've taken all the tests. It's real. A heavy silence settled between us as we both absorbed the implications. She was carrying my child. Not Clark's. Mine. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. This wasn't just a complication, it was a bombshell, one that could shatter everything if it came to light. Clark, oblivious to what was happening under his nose, had no idea that the woman he thought was his would soon bear a child that wasn't his. What about Clark? I asked cautiously, my voice calm but tight. My mind churned through the potential fallout, trying to calculate my next move. No, she whispered firmly, shaking her head. He can't know. Her resolve was clear, but so was the fear behind it. She was terrified, not just of what this meant for her marriage, but of what it meant for us. For everything we had set in motion. I reached out, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder, meeting her teary gaze with determination. We'll figure this out, I said quietly, my voice firm. Inside, though, my thoughts were racing. The game had just changed, and I had to adjust my strategy. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about the future, and that future now included a child. My child. He doesn't know anything. I haven't told him yet, she said, her voice trembling. I don't want to hurt him. I cut her off, my tone firm but calm. He's been hurting you for years, Daisy. He deserves to know the truth. And you? You deserve to be free of him. Tears streaked her cheeks as she shook her head, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt. I can't tell him. I don't know how he'll react. I stepped closer, my hands settling on her shoulders, steadying her as I locked eyes with her. Listen to me, I said softly but firmly. This is our chance. He's not what you need anymore, and deep down, you know that. He's neglected you, taken you for granted while you've carried everything on your own. But you're not alone anymore. You have me. Her expression softened, her watery gaze searching mine as my words began to sink in. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You can, I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. You don't have to do this alone. You don't owe him anything anymore, Daisy. She hesitated, her tears still falling, but I could see something shift in her. A realization that the life she'd known was already unraveling and there was no stopping it now. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice breaking as she clutched the fabric of her sleeve. I cupped her face in my hands, brushing away her tears with my thumbs. You don't have to be scared. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll face this together. For a moment, we stood there, the gravity of the situation settling over us like a heavy fog. Outside the kitchen door, the sounds of the party carried on, the hum of laughter and clinking glasses a sharp contrast to the storm brewing between us. Daisy was pregnant with my child, and Clark had no idea. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had taken my wife, but now I had taken something far more precious from him. We couldn't keep this a secret forever. The truth would come out eventually, and when it did, it would destroy everything he thought he had. That was exactly what I wanted. I needed him to feel it all, the betrayal, the loss, the unraveling of his carefully constructed life. I needed him to understand what it meant to lose everything. Daisy took a shaky but steadying breath, her hands instinctively resting over her stomach, a gesture that made it clear she knew exactly what was at stake. We'll figure it out, I reassured her, my voice calm and resolute. She nodded, wiping away the last of her tears, her resolve hardening as she met my gaze. Okay. There was no going back now. Everything had changed and soon everyone else would know. But for now, we would keep the secret a little longer, let the tension simmer and build until it couldn't be contained any longer. When we returned to the party, the scene before us was almost laughable. Clark's boisterous laughter echoed across the room, his arm casually slung around Bonnie's shoulders as she beamed up at him. The two of them looked so pleased with themselves, so smug in their belief that they'd pulled off their charade without a hitch. They had no idea their perfect little world was on the verge of collapse. I caught Daisy's gaze as she glanced at Clark, then back at me. Fear flickered in her eyes, but there was something else there too. Something darker, more resolute. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about the reckoning that was barreling toward all of us, unstoppable and inevitable. The truth would come out, and when it did, the devastation would be absolute. Clark and Bonnie wouldn't just lose their carefully cultivated lives. They'd lose everything they had taken for granted. And when that moment arrived, I would be there, standing in the middle of the ruins, watching everything they loved burn to the ground. The party unfolded as though nothing sinister lurked beneath its polished surface. No furtive glances, no clandestine schemes, no intricate plots unraveling in the shadows. Yet I could sense it, a quiet tension rippling through the laughter and polite chatter like a current under calm water. Bonnie, as usual, was at the center of it all. She leaned toward Clark, her hand lightly grazing his arm. A gesture so subtle it could have been innocent, though anyone who truly knew her would see it for what it was. She reveled in the attention, savoring each word exchanged with Clark as though it were some rare delicacy. She was oblivious, of course, that this could be her final night basking in the illusion of her perfect little world, where every whim of hers was indulged without question. Then, as if sensing my gaze, Bonnie looked up. For a fraction of a second, her face faltered, her confident mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of unease. But almost instantly, her smile returned, breezy and self-assured, as though daring the universe to challenge her reign. The eyes that once reflected my entire world were now cold, in different pools, hiding whatever secrets she thought she could keep. Daisy lingered a bit further back, half hidden, her eyes flitting nervously toward me. I caught her trying to meet my gaze, though she quickly looked away whenever our eyes met. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind like a drumbeat, a mix of power and burden clinging to it. I wondered if she could hide it from Clark, and if she couldn't, what the fallout would look like. In my mind, the pieces moved slowly across the board, deliberate and inevitable, each outcome unfolding like a chess game I had already mastered. As the hours melted into night, my focus remained fixed on Bonnie and Clark. The way their smiles lingered a little too long, the easy touches, the flirtatious laughter. Innocent enough for anyone else, but not for me. Soon all of it would end. I stepped away to the bar and poured myself a whiskey, the burn of the liquor grounding me. Someone moved behind me, almost silently. Daisy. I turned slightly, taking in her anxious expression. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but uncertainty won. I gave her a small, calming nod, silently reassuring her that everything was still on track. "How can you stay so calm, Elton?" she whispered, her voice almost shaking. She glanced around to ensure no one could overhear. "I can't keep pretending. Not for much longer." "We're close, Daisy," I murmured back, low enough for her ears alone. "Trust me. When this is over, they'll pay for every lie, every deceit." Her eyes darkened, a flicker of something sharp crossing her face. Perhaps hope, perhaps vengeance. She gave me the smallest nod, her silent agreement sealing the moment before she withdrew back into the crowd. By the time dawn crept in and the guests began filtering out, I found Bonnie's gaze one last time. There was a trace of wariness in her eyes now, but no suspicion, only that smug confidence she wore like a crown. She still believed she had control over everything, blissfully unaware of how close she was to losing it all. The week that followed was heavy with unspoken words and charged silences. The tension between us and our spouses coiled tighter with each passing day. I knew our secret meetings couldn't have gone unnoticed. Sooner or later, Bonnie and Clark would start putting the pieces together. Daisy and I were playing with fire, and I was ready for the flames. But something new had crept in between Daisy and me. A dark, unspoken doubt that neither of us wanted to name. One evening, Daisy and I sat in her car, hidden in a shadowy corner far from prying eyes. The silence between us stretched thick, suffocating. I watched her fingers twist a crumpled handkerchief, her head bowed as though the weight of her thoughts was too much to bear. "I've realized something," she said finally, her voice low and tight. She didn't look at me, her words edged with bitterness. "Have you ever noticed how often Clark has these important things to do? How he comes home late, smelling faintly of perfume that isn't mine?" I stayed silent, letting her words hang there. She wasn't asking for answers. She was unraveling the truth aloud, a truth she'd clearly been avoiding. "And then there's this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I found something in his car, a hairpin." Her voice was brittle now, barely audible. "Gold with a tiny emerald. It's not mine." At last, she turned to look at me, and I saw the hurt swimming in her eyes. "Bonnie wore one just like it to the party." The air in the car seemed to thicken. Clark had been meticulous, but not meticulous enough. His mistakes were stacking up, forming an unmistakable picture of betrayal. "You've suspected this for a while, haven't you?" I asked quietly. Daisy nodded, her hands trembling in her lap as if she were holding on to herself just to keep from breaking apart. She pressed her hands tightly against her face, as though she could physically block the tears threatening to spill over. "I always believed he was the one person who would never betray me," she choked out, wiping at her damp eyes with trembling fingers. "And now it turns out he's with her. Your wife, Elton." We sat there in silence, the weight of her words settling around us like a shroud. Each detail of this unraveling tragedy seemed to sink deeper into our bones. Daisy didn't need convincing. Her certainty had been absolute from the start. As for me, I was teetering on the thin line between triumph and disappointment. Clark and Bonnie had no idea they were orchestrating their own downfall. They were blind, blissfully building the path to their own destruction. All I had to do was nudge the truth forward, let it tear through the surface like a jagged shard of glass. "Daisy," I said at last, my voice soft but deliberate. "You know this isn't just about revenge anymore. You wanted the truth. But this is only the beginning." She turned to look at me, and for a moment, the sorrow and anger in her eyes seemed to deepen, but so did her resolve. "No," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of her determination. "It's not over." Her fingers tightened around mine, trembling with a mix of fury and pain. She wasn't just mourning Clark's betrayal anymore. She was craving something more. A need to watch his carefully constructed world collapse into ashes. The toll of her pregnancy began to show itself soon after, creeping in without mercy. One morning, during one of our quiet meetings at the secluded cafe we always favored, Daisy looked pale and drawn. Her hands shook faintly as they hovered over her coffee, and she kept pressing a hand against her stomach, her face pinched in discomfort. At first, she tried to laugh it off, brushing aside the obvious signs of her weakening body. "It's nothing," she said with a strained smile, though the pallor of her skin and the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. But when her smile faltered, her voice dropped to a whisper. "I can't hide it anymore," she admitted, glancing nervously around the room, as if someone might be listening in. "I don't know how much longer I can pretend everything's fine. Clark's already starting to suspect something." Her words settled in me like a cold stone. Anxiety mingled with a faint, guilty satisfaction. The moment of reckoning was drawing closer. She would have no choice but to tell Clark the truth eventually, but not yet. I couldn't allow the timing to slip beyond my control. "You have to hold on," I told her firmly, reaching for her trembling hand. "It'll be over soon. When the time is right, you can tell him everything. But not now. Not yet." She nodded faintly, her resolve flickering but not breaking. Though the nausea was wearing her thin, I could still see the fierce determination in her eyes. This was our secret, one we shared and protected, one that held the power to shatter everything. But as the days dragged on, holding the truth back became harder. Clark, observant and skeptical by nature, had already started piecing things together. He wasn't blind to Daisy's sudden mood swings, her pale complexion, and her obvious weakness. One evening, as they sat together at dinner, his patience finally snapped. "Daisy, what's going on with you lately?" His voice was steady, but there was suspicion behind his words. He fixed her with a sharp, searching look. "You're on edge. You're sick all the time. Is there something you're not telling me?" Daisy froze for a second, her fork clattering softly against her plate. Panic fluttered in her chest, but she forced herself to keep her face still, turning her gaze away. "No," she replied, her voice clipped and cold. "Just a little cold. Nothing to worry about." But Clark wasn't buying it, and she could feel it. His suspicion had shifted into something heavier, something dangerous. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and before she could stop herself, the words slipped out. "Clark," she began, her tone hardening, "why don't you tell me whose hairpin I found in your car?" Clark's face stiffened. His fork paused midair, and for a moment, he simply stared at her, as though he hadn't quite heard the question. Then he smiled. A thin, forced smile that didn't touch his eyes. "A hairpin? I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe someone left it by accident. A coworker, maybe, dropped off his wife or sister, and she must have forgotten it." Daisy's hands clenched around the edge of the table, her knuckles white with the force of it. She wasn't letting him worm his way out of this. Her eyes, blazing with something beyond suspicion now, locked onto his. "Don't lie to me, Clark," she said, her voice low and cutting. "I saw it. A gold hairpin with a small emerald. The kind of thing you don't just accidentally leave behind." She leaned forward, her words laced with venom. "Bonnie wore one just like it at the party." The room fell into silence, Clark's expression frozen, as if Daisy's accusation had struck him like a physical blow. His flimsy excuses dissolved in the face of the undeniable truth, and for the first time, she saw something crack in him. Something desperate. Clark's expression hardened, and for the first time, Daisy saw something unfamiliar in his face. An emotion she could only describe as panic, caught like a criminal with nowhere to run. Her pulse quickened, but beneath the rush of adrenaline, there was a new determination in her. She wasn't backing down. When Daisy suggested inviting Bonnie and me to their house for Clark and Daisy's anniversary dinner, I understood immediately that this wasn't about celebration. It wasn't a polite evening of laughter and shared memories. This was a reckoning in disguise. There was a glint in Daisy's eyes, a quiet, ruthless resolve that told me she was ready to tear everything apart. Lay the cards bare, scatter the ashes, and watch Bonnie and Clark's fragile world collapse at their feet. I agreed without hesitation. I knew this evening could change everything. The following night, Bonnie and I arrived at their home. Bonnie, ever the actress, was smiling, carefree, completely unaware of the storm waiting to break. She had always loved these friendly gatherings, opportunities to laugh, sip wine, and slip comfortably into her polished, innocent facade. Tonight, though, she seemed almost too at ease, her mind far away from suspicion or doubt. Clark greeted us warmly, his charm in full display as though nothing could rattle him. He was the picture of calm, his mask so intact it might have fooled anyone who didn't know better. But I did. I knew his secrets, and tonight, there would be no escape. Dinner began as any other. Pleasant, shallow conversation, glasses of wine clinking in practiced rhythm, smiles exchanged like currency. But underneath the laughter, the air was electric, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. And Daisy held the match. The moment came after dinner, the plates pushed aside, the wine glasses half full. Daisy stood, her movements deliberate, her glass untouched. She raised it, her gaze lingering on Clark for a fraction longer than it should have. "To the truth," she said softly, her voice sharp enough to cut through the atmosphere. It wasn't just a toast. It was a declaration of war. Bonnie laughed awkwardly, her smile flickering like a candle in the wind. The truth? She asked, her voice light but strained. Did we miss something, Daisy? And then it was my turn. I set my glass down carefully, looking straight at Bonnie. I chose my words with precision, each syllable calculated to hit where it would hurt the most. Actually, yes. I began with a faint smile that vanished just as quickly. You've missed quite a lot, Bonnie. Like the moment I came home and found you and Clark in our bedroom. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Bonnie's face drained of color, her smile gone as though wiped clean by an invisible hand. Across from her, Clark froze, jaw clenched, hands curling into fists on the table. For the first time, they looked exactly as they were, cornered, exposed, defenseless. I thought, Bonnie stammered, her voice brittle, I thought you hadn't. That I hadn't noticed? That I didn't care. I cut her off sharply, my gaze unflinching. I saw enough, Bonnie. Enough to know that whatever we had once meant nothing to you. You betrayed me the same way Clark betrayed Daisy. Clark's head snapped toward Daisy, searching her face for some sign of forgiveness or support. He found none. Her eyes were cold, filled with contempt that burned through him like a brand. Clark, Daisy said, her voice steady but full of simmering rage. Just tell me one thing. The hairpin I found in your car. It belongs to Bonnie, doesn't it? She leaned forward slightly, her words pinning him down. Don't lie to me. Not anymore. Clark exhaled shakily, lowering his head as if the weight of the truth were physically bearing down on him. After a long silence, he nodded, his voice barely audible. Yes, he muttered. It's Bonnie's. I used to see her, but it was nothing, just a fling. It didn't mean anything. His confession was like a slap to Bonnie's face. She turned to him in disbelief, her eyes wide with horror. Just a fling, she whispered, her voice trembling. It didn't mean anything? Anger began to rise in her, her cheeks flushed. You used me, Clark. Lied to me. Made me believe there was more between us. Clark looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze, as though he thought ignoring her fury would make it disappear. Daisy stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She looked down at Clark, her expression a mixture of disgust and cold finality. You betrayed me for this? She said, her voice laced with venom. An affair that meant nothing to you? Is that really all you have to say for yourself? Bonnie, shaking, covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling as silent sobs racked her body. But it didn't move me. Not anymore. All I felt was a cold, ruthless satisfaction watching their world come apart. Every carefully crafted lie, every smug smile obliterated in the light of the truth. Silence fell like a shroud over the room, heavy and suffocating. Clark and Bonnie sat there, stripped of their confidence, hollowed out, as though the weight of their mistakes had finally crushed them. But this was only the first strike. I turned to Daisy, who gave me a small, resolute nod, her expression urging me forward. I met Bonnie and Clark's shattered gazes, my voice steady and unyielding. I realized a long time ago there was no future left for us, I said, my tone measured but final. You destroyed everything we had built. But for Daisy and me, this isn't the end. It's the beginning of something real, something profound, something you could never understand. Bonnie tried to speak, but her voice cracked, her words caught in her throat. I didn't give her the chance. My eyes stayed on her as I continued. When I truly saw Daisy, I knew I had found someone who was worth far more than you'll ever be. Smart, strong, beautiful. She deserves the best. Something you, Clark, could never give her. I turned to Clark then, my voice cutting deep. You took her trust and threw it away, just like you did with Bonnie's. But that's done now. It's over. Daisy and I, we have a future. Our future. Clark slumped back, his face ashen, while Bonnie sat in stunned silence, the tears streaking her face now meaningless. Their perfect, polished facade had been shattered into irreparable pieces, and there they sat, surrounded by the wreckage of their own making. For the first time, I felt no guilt, only triumph. Bonnie visibly stiffened at my words, her face twisting into an unsettling mix of disbelief and horror. Her confidence, already fragile, seemed to shatter entirely as she processed what I'd just said. Daisy, catching my eye, smiled faintly, a small, victorious gesture, and then turned her attention back to Clark. "Yes," she said softly but with unwavering determination. "Elton and I have a future I never had with you, Clark, because there hasn't been trust between us for a long time. No trust, no real affection. It all crumbled the moment you decided you could use me, as if I was something you owned. But that's over now. I have something far greater than the empty lies you tried to sell me." Her hand moved gently to her stomach. The silence in the room turned thick and unrelenting, like a heavy fog no one could push through. Clark and Bonnie stared at Daisy's small gesture as if they were frozen in time, as if they already knew the truth but couldn't bear to face it. "We're going to have a child," Daisy said, her voice quiet but carrying an edge of finality that made every word land like a blow. "A child born from love, not deception. We aren't hiding it and we aren't ashamed. Unlike you, we don't cower in the shadows to justify our weaknesses." Clark went pale, his gaze darting frantically around the room like he was searching for a way out. But there was no escape this time. Bonnie stood frozen, her hands clasped against her chest. Her tear-glazed eyes filled not with anger or pain, but with an almost surreal disbelief, a dawning realization that she was losing something she hadn't even fully understood. "How?" Bonnie whispered, barely audible, her gaze flickering to me. "How could you?" But her voice lacked fire, as if the words themselves were too weak to carry any accusation. There was no anger, no venom, just a faint shadow of something long dead, a memory of what she might have once felt for me. I looked at her, my expression cold, unyielding. "How could I?" I repeated, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "You really want to talk about what's real, Bonnie? Don't act like you didn't destroy that yourself the moment you let Clark into your life. You betrayed me, and you didn't even look back to see what you were losing. So don't stand there and demand loyalty when you gave none." Clark finally found his voice, though it was weak, trembling, completely stripped of the confidence he once wielded so easily. "Daisy, you can't. I never meant to lose you," he stammered, his words coming out like a plea. "It was just a fling. It didn't mean anything. I swear." Daisy turned to him then, her expression hardening with a bitterness that had been building for months. "Nothing?" she repeated, a cold laugh slipping out, devoid of humor. "It didn't mean anything? That's supposed to make it better?" She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a mix of disgust and anger. "You never cared how I felt, Clark, as long as you were enjoying your lies. But for me, this was never just a passing emotion. You're the one who ruined everything. And you know what? I'm just glad I finally see you for what you really are." Clark fell silent, his shoulders slumping as the truth crashed down on him. Bonnie said nothing, her face still pale and tear-streaked, her hands trembling slightly as she clung to the last remnants of the illusion she'd built. Daisy and I stood before them, unshaken and unrepentant. This was their reckoning, their consequences, their end. For us, it was something else entirely. A beginning. We had carved out a path for ourselves, free from their lies, their betrayal. In the days and weeks that followed, the truth spread like wildfire, leaving destruction in its wake. Bonnie and Clark's world began to disintegrate, slowly but surely. I watched as their lives, once so perfectly curated, crumbled into ruins they couldn't repair. Clark retreated into himself, a shell of the man he once was. The realization of what he had lost clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake. Bonnie, on the other hand, seemed almost unrecognizable. Her confident, radiant demeanor had vanished entirely. She looked gaunt, her once bright smile a ghost of its former self. Her eyes, dull, hollow, told a story of a woman who had finally come face to face with the cost of her choices. By the time the divorce proceedings began, there was no love left to fight for, only the tangled remnants of what had been. The process was grueling, long, and bitter, but Daisy and I had already made peace with it. Every time I saw Bonnie or Clark in the courtroom, it was as if they were shadows of the people they used to be. Bonnie sat slumped, her energy drained, while Clark looked resigned, empty and beaten down, fully aware that he had lost far more than just his marriage. When it came time to divide the property, Daisy and I were fair. We took what we needed, nothing more. We didn't want to strip them of everything. That would have been too easy, too merciful. No, all we wanted was enough to build the life we deserved. The life their lies had once kept out of reach. And so, we moved forward, leaving them behind in the wreckage they'd created. For Daisy and me, this wasn't the end of something broken. It was the beginning of something real. I handed Bonnie the keys to the house she had once ruled, a home she had filled with charm and self-assured confidence. Now it was just a hollow shell, empty of the life we'd shared, a life she had carelessly destroyed. Her expression was unreadable, but the silence that followed said more than words ever could. Daisy did the same with Clark, leaving him behind in the home that had become nothing more than a mausoleum of memories, a constant reminder of what he had squandered. With the proceeds from the settlements, Daisy and I bought a small, inviting house on the outskirts of town. It was far from grand, but it was ours, a sanctuary untainted by the shadows of betrayal and pain. This house was more than just walls and a roof. It was a symbol of everything we had fought for, everything we had survived. Each room held light, warmth, and the promise of laughter. We built it together, piece by piece, choosing every detail as if we were crafting the very foundation of our new life. The furniture we selected wasn't extravagant, but each piece fit us perfectly. The living room became our cozy retreat, filled with soft throws and warm lighting. The kitchen, always full of delicious aromas, became the heart of the house. In our evenings on the terrace, under a sky painted with stars, we dreamed of the life our child would lead, painting visions of the future with every word we shared. Daisy was radiant. Her eyes, once clouded with pain, now sparkled with a calmness I had longed to see. There was joy in her laughter, strength in her presence. It felt as though the world had finally given us a chance to breathe, to live, really live. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clark were left to pick up the pieces of the ruins they had created. Bonnie tried to stitch together a semblance of her old life, but the threads unraveled in her hands. Every room in the house I had left her whispered accusations of what she had done, leaving her haunted and reclusive. She withdrew from her friends and social circle, unable to face their pitying glances. Clark was no better. He buried himself in his work, hiding behind stacks of papers and endless hours at the office, but the fire in him was gone. His once unshakable ambition had crumbled, leaving him adrift, a man stripped of purpose. Without Daisy, his life seemed hollow, a gray shadow of what it had been. He could only stand on the sidelines, watching as Daisy found joy and love elsewhere, a future that had nothing to do with him. Our home, by contrast, overflowed with life. It was filled with laughter, quiet touches, and the anticipation of the new life we were about to welcome. Every day was meaningful in a way it had never been before, and we cherished it all. When the time came for the gender reveal party, Daisy and I decided to keep it hidden from others, surrounded only by close friends. We transformed the house into a scene of warmth and celebration. Soft pastel balloons swaying gently in the corners, the table adorned with small touches of pink and blue. Laughter echoed through the walls as we all gathered, the air thick with anticipation. Daisy and I stood together, holding hands tightly as we looked at the cake. Our secret was hidden within it, waiting to be revealed with one slice. I could feel Daisy's excitement, her fingers trembling slightly in mine as we cut through the delicate frosting. The knife slid down, and the moment the soft pink filling peeked through, the room erupted into cheers. "A girl!" someone shouted with joy, and Daisy let out a soft laugh that was half tears, half elation. I wrapped my arms around her as she whispered, "We're having a daughter." The words hung in the air, perfect and irreversible, filling us both with a happiness we couldn't contain. The days that followed were a flurry of preparation. Daisy and I poured our love into creating a perfect room for our little girl. I painted the walls a soothing pastel pink, the color warm and welcoming, like a morning sunrise. Daisy carefully chose every detail, the furniture, the decorations, and even the smallest touches. A sturdy wooden crib stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a tiny dresser and a rocking chair where we knew we'd spend many quiet nights. The shelves were filled with soft toys, each one chosen with care, and a musical mobile hung delicately above the crib, its gentle lullaby ready to accompany our daughter's first dreams. Every night, Daisy and I would walk into the nursery, our hands brushing over the crib rail or the edge of the chair, our hearts full as we imagined her first laugh, her first words, her tiny fingers wrapping around ours. And then, at last, the day came. Daisy gave birth to our daughter, and I was overcome with a joy so deep it felt as though my heart might burst. I waited at the birthing center, clutching the flowers and the small, golden pendant I had carefully prepared. A heart-shaped charm engraved with the words, "Beloved Mommy." When I saw Daisy holding our daughter for the first time, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy, I knew we had found our way to the life we were meant to have. There, in that small hospital room, surrounded by soft coos and whispered promises, our future unfolded before us, bright, real, and unshakable. When Daisy emerged from the birthing center, cradling our daughter in her arms, I stepped forward and placed the small, velvet-wrapped box into her hand. "This," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion, "is to honor you for giving me the most precious miracle of my life. You are my beautiful, favorite mom, and now we have our little princess." Daisy's eyes filled with fresh tears as she smiled down at the gift. Her happiness was radiant, almost breathtaking, and in that moment, it felt as though the world had aligned perfectly for us. Together, we carefully placed our baby girl into her special carrier, ready to take her to her first home, the house we had built with so much love and hope. Those early days with our daughter felt nothing short of magical. Each moment carried a quiet wonder as we marveled at every sound she made, every tiny movement of her hands or flutter of her eyelashes. We nurtured her with all the tenderness in our hearts, as though the world itself had shrunk down to just the three of us. In the mornings, I often took long walks with Daisy and the baby, guiding the stroller slowly through quiet paths as the fresh air surrounded us. The warm sun kissed our faces, and the breeze rustled the trees above, creating a serene backdrop for our new life. We would watch our daughter's peaceful expression, her little face untouched by worry or care, and then glance at each other with knowing smiles. This wasn't just love, it was something deeper. We were a family now. One particularly bright spring day, as the blossoms swayed gently on the trees and the scent of fresh greenery lingered in the air, we unexpectedly crossed paths with Bonnie. I noticed her before she reached us. She had frozen mid-step at the sight of us, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though she might turn back. But then, gathering herself, she walked toward us with hesitant steps. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze softening as it fell on the baby asleep in the stroller. "I see you're happy," she said quietly, her voice carrying the faintest tremor. Her lips curved into a sad smile, one that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken regrets. "You know, Elton, I'm so sorry for what I did. Cheating on you was the biggest mistake of my life. I destroyed everything, and I lost the man who truly loved me." Her words hung in the air, heavy yet sincere, and for the first time, they felt like closure. Daisy and I exchanged a glance, and without needing to say it aloud, we both understood. Anger and bitterness had no place here. Not anymore. "Thank you, Bonnie," Daisy replied softly, her voice gentle yet firm. "Thank you for saying that. Elton and we are happy now, and we'll do everything we can to cherish what we have." Bonnie nodded faintly, her smile trembling just a little. Her eyes glistened, though whether it was from sadness, relief, or some combination of both, I couldn't tell. She didn't say anything else. Perhaps there was nothing more to say. With a quiet goodbye, she turned and walked away, her silhouette slowly disappearing down the path. Daisy and I stood there for a moment, watching as Bonnie drifted out of sight. There was no triumph in that meeting, only peace, a final exhale of something that had lingered for too long. I turned to Daisy, and she looked back at me with that radiant, contented smile I'd come to love so deeply. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it softly. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's keep going." We walked on together, our daughter nestled safely in her stroller, surrounded by sunlight and the sounds of spring. In that moment, the future stretched out before us, clear, bright, and filled with nothing but promise. It belonged to us now, our love, our family, our new beginning.